Hello and welcome to the core of everything. Today we're looking at subduction zones. So a lot of people know that the Earth's crust is made up of large slabs known as plates. And the boundary between these plates means that they slide against each other, move apart from each other, or smash against each other. And such boundaries have huge geological features, including the San Andreas Fault through California, Iceland in the North Atlantic, and the islands of Japan. And these can form earthquakes, and the melting of crust might produce volcanoes. Today we have Dr Lior Suchoy on the podcast to talk about a specific type of process at plate boundaries, which is known as subduction. And these zones result in the movement of one plate under the other, which can produce powerful earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, and landslides. Lior is a research associate at Imperial College London and specialises in subduction zone dynamics. He uses numerical modelling with C++, Python, and MATLAB to understand the dynamics of subduction zones, amongst many other things. It's a really interesting conversation.
Before we kick off this week's episode, I'd like to refer listeners to episodes 2 and 7 if you want a bit of background on what's inside the Earth or plate tectonics before jumping in with Lior. We've also had a message in from last week's episode all about caves. We were talking about stalagmites and stalactites, so stalagmites rising up from the ground, stalactites hanging down from the ceiling. And this came from Sophie in West London, and she was talking about how she's seen when these actually meet together. When this happens, we would call them columns, pillars, or stalagnates. All types of speleothems, so kind of cave deposits. So thank you very much, Sophie. Please keep the messages coming in.
Drip feed, that shout out.
Very nice.
Dripping it in. Drip feed.
Yeah.
Yeah. Enjoy the episode. Dr Lior Suchoy, welcome on to the podcast.
Thank you.
The core of everything. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on. And today we're talking about subduction zones. So we're going to start off by basically explaining what is subduction and why is it important?
So when we imagine sort of the map of the world, we can imagine continents and then oceans. And sort of the layer underneath this, or what makes this happen, are a set of plates that are positioned all around the globe, and they're moving either towards or apart or side by side. And when those plates move towards each other, if one of them is buoyant and the other one is less buoyant, one will go down, the other one will stay up. Now, the process of a plate going downwards toward the Earth, this is what we call subduction. And it's intrinsically connected to this system of plates that we call plate tectonics.
Okay, so there are pieces of crust, large slabs of Earth's crust that are called plates, and there's some that are oceanic and some that are continental. And so there's buoyancy differences, which means that some move under the others.
Yes. I mean, funny enough, when we say oceanic and continental, what we refer to is not necessarily what's on them. So the fact that they have land and oceans on them, we refer to the density. Just the fact that something is denser, like the oceanic plate, means that it goes downwards, and so water comes on top of it, and that is where you're likely to find the oceans. It doesn't have to be this way, so there are heavier plates that don't necessarily have seas on them, or there's actually more lighter plates that do have seas on them. But it roughly corresponds. So where the oceans are, this is where the heavy part is. Where the continents are, this is usually where the light part is.
Okay, and that's due to the geology of the plates themselves. So they just have, under the ocean, it just happens to be more igneous rock.
Yes. Although when you say that, you tend to think about the immediate depth, right below the soil. While when we talk about plates, we're talking about something that can be 7 kilometer thin up to, say, 120, 150. I can't remember the exact maximum thickness of it, but for the continental plates, it can be over 100 kilometers thick. So again, if you try to imagine in your mind a plate, you should think about the soil as really the top of everything, and the rest of it is just 100 kilometers of rock going down. And yes, this part will be more igneous in the oceans, and then more light of different varieties in the continents.
Okay. Is it a continuum between the kind of the two densities, or is it quite sort of bimodal? You either have a very dense or very low dense.
So the quick answer is that it's bimodal.
Okay.
But the truth is that there are a lot of gray space in between. So you do find those kind of mixed crust, or you find this diluted continental plates and so on. But really, we think about just oceanic plates as being heavy and made out of one heavy material. And then we think about continental plates as being sort of an assortment of a lot of light material. And that goes into how we think they were formed. So I think we'll talk today about how the oceanic plates are formed, but really there's a whole different discussion about how continental plates are formed and how they accumulate all this light material.
Well, you've already prompted us on to the next question. Lior, how do they form?
Okay, yeah. Sure. So think about it in a way like, I don't know, a conveyor belt can be a fine way, although a conveyor belt moves and this doesn't necessarily move. So we'll stick with the conveyor belt and then I'll demolish this analogy. But
Getting nice and confusing to the audience. That was
sorry. Okay, so a conveyor belt will have slabs coming up and then moving along the conveyor belt and then falling down and then back up. But let's ignore the part that goes back up for a minute. So when the bit comes up and touches the surface, the air, the water, whatever it is on the surface, it's effectively just mantle material, right? It's really hot, it's really igneous, and then it cools down really, really quickly. So that'll be the top crust, okay? Now, this top crust gets cold very quickly, and then it takes time for the part below it to transmit heat through it. So you have a process of slowly cooling down from the top towards the bottom. But remember, the mantle is still hot. So it's not that the top is cooling everything down, but from below there's no other effect. So you get this balance between cold top and hot bottom. And the longer this process goes on, the more you move towards a steady state. So right at the part that the slab comes up, and again, I'm going back to this conveyor belt analogy, which is not great, but at the point where the slab comes up, it's very, very, very thin, okay? And then the further it gets away, so the longer it has time to cool down, the more we are closer to a steady state.
And is that, sorry, where it gets thin, is that the sort of the edge of the plate? Is that what you mean?
Oh, it's one edge of the plate. So we call these places mid-ocean ridges. Which is, well, we call them mid-ocean ridges because where the mantle comes up, it creates a ridge, a set of usually volcanoes. It can be like spots of volcanoes in places. It can be just a line of volcanoes in other places. That kind of depends on the velocity.
I think a really good analogy for, well, not really an analogy, but Iceland is a clear example where you can see the mid-ocean ridge that reaches the surface. Is that right? Because that runs all the way through the Atlantic Ocean, that ridge, but we only see it at the surface really at Iceland.
It does, and it is a good example as long as you consider it to be a way of an outlier example, because in Iceland you also have something called a hotspot, and that's why you can actually see Iceland on the surface. So most of these will still be made out of oceanic material, oceanic crust, oceanic plate, which again is heavy, so it will be submerged. Yeah. So that's, I mean, Iceland is a good example just because we can see it, but it doesn't necessarily represent what we have in the oceans. Okay. So we can think about this as sort of the beginning of the plate. And then as the plate moves away from this mid-ocean ridge, it cools down, it gets to a thickness of 100 kilometers at most on the most thick part. And then eventually it will encounter another plate. And when it does, the very thick part, being the heaviest part, will subduct, will fall down below the other plate and start sinking towards the center of the Earth, towards the core. And that is an interesting process just because during this cooling phase, what you get is also higher density. So people can imagine, well, I guess any kind of hot fluid that cools down, maybe apart from water. So, ice is lighter than water, but that's the outlier. That's not the the normal occurrence. So for any other material, like plate material, when it cools down, becomes heavier, and then it tends to sink into the sort of lighter surrounding mantle. Because remember, we are talking about the same material, essentially, right? This mantle that comes up in the mid-ocean ridge, right? It is the same material as the plate that goes down later. Only one is hot, the other is cold. And as this plate falls through the mantle, it will get hit up eventually, but what it does mostly is just drags the mantle with it.
Okay. And that's our process of subduction, where it gets dragged underneath another plate.
Yes, well, it doesn't get dragged underneath another plate. It drags the mantle with it under another plate.
I see. So, I mean, this idea of a conveyor belt rises in the middle, comes and then moves across, and then falls down. We get taught in school, when I did geology in A-level, we get taught that this process is driven by convection within the mantle. This idea that the mantle moves due to heat that gets transferred from the very sort of hot core all the way up to the lithosphere where the crust is. And that drives the mantle convection, which drives plate motion. But I guess that's not really true, or is that a misconception?
It is. It's a very common misconception, actually. I think we did a bit of work about it the other day, and you can see like BBC documentaries that described it this way. So it's very common, and it used to be what people thought of, just because they also imagined the mantle as being like an ocean under the plates. Well, we know this is not ocean. This is just rocks that are movable in a way. So low viscosity rocks, they can more easily move than high viscosity rocks like the plates. Getting back to your question, when the mantle is being dragged with the plate in the subduction zone, right? The plate takes the mantle with it, and then there's a vacuum or a low pressure area behind it, which makes mantle from below go back up. So if you think about the whole system, it's the engine of it. It's not necessarily heat coming from the core all the way up. It's more like the plate that drags everything with it and kind of forces those cells to form. And the size of the cell, and the velocity of the cell, everything will be determined by the velocity of the plate and the size of the plate, not the other way around. So yes, a common misconception, an understandable one, because most of the processes we see on the surface will be more of a moving flow from below that moves everything that floats on top. But that's not the case here.
What do you mean by cell? Sorry. You said
cell. Yeah, sorry. So if we think about a convection, right, it has a rising part and a falling part.
Right.
So the classic example is when you think about a boiling pot of water, right? You see the bubbles go up, and then something has to go down in order to fill that void, right? And that's a cell, right? Something goes up, flows on the surface, and then goes back down.
It's one circular motion.
Yes, exactly. Okay. And if you think about a subducting plate, so if you can imagine, say, the Pacific Ocean, right? It has a cell on the east side and a cell on the west side, and then the mid-ocean ridge, it goes kind of in the center of the ocean. Not exactly the center, but for the purpose of this discussion, it does. So you have plates rising at the surface, moving to the two sides. So these are two different plates. One is subducting at the east, one is subducting at the west. And they create the cells on the east and the west side. And these cells are quite different. They're different in size, they're different in velocity. And of course, it will be naive to think that they don't impact. So there's a lot of feedback between those processes, right? Once one side starts subducting and determines the velocity of a cell, this will impact all the other mantle around it. Because, of course, there's friction, there's interaction or traction between one cell and the other. So in a sort of ideal system, it's only the plate that determines those dynamics. But really, in the real Earth, these processes are connected. But the main factor that determines how mantle is moving is the plate, or other subducting plates.
Okay. And the processes within the mid-Atlantic or mid-ocean ridge and the process at the subduction zones, do they have this idea of and we've heard of ridge push and slab pull. Is that a misconception as well, or is that something that
No, it's not a misconception. So these processes do exist. Just the magnitude of them is sometimes misunderstood.
Hyped up.
No. So slab pull, the fact that the heavy side of the slab is pulling everything down, that's the process we just discussed.
Yeah.
People tend to think about ridge push as mantle coming up from the ridge and pushing things aside. That's not really what's happening there. There is some horizontal forces at the ridge, but they tend to be of a, say, 10th of the magnitude of slab pull. So it does happen. It does have a lot of effect to sort of shift things from one dynamic mode to a different dynamic mode, but it's not the main force that will determine subduction in general. I should say we did some work 3-4 years ago looking at other forces involved in the system. So, for example, when you move the plate, the horizontal part of the plate, so I'm not talking about the slab, the part of the plate that is falling down. There's a different part of the plate that just moves horizontally on top of the mantle, right? It drags the mantle with it as well, right? Now, the forces, the friction between the mantle and this part of the plate will also impact, say, things like velocity. It can also shift the dynamics from one mode to a different mode. And for example, for quite big plates, this traction below, and again, the horizontal part of the plate, the traction there can be as significant as, say, ridge push. So, there are other forces involved. There's also coupling between the plates and so on. But I mean, I don't think that's the main thing we want to discuss today. But just keep in mind that apart from the simplified system, there are different forces involved as well.
But also there's ideas that the angle at which the plate is getting subducted affects certain aspects of it as well.
Or definitely. Yes. Yeah. So again, there's a kind of a chicken and an egg thing here. So you would think that the angle, for example, will determine the velocity. While in many cases it is the velocity that determines the angle, and so on. So a good example of this is, say, subduction below the Mariana subduction zone, which is known for the Mariana Trench, where the deepest part of the ocean is. And there you have a very, very steep angle, a very, very old plate. So question is it the very old plate, the fact that it's very, very heavy, and tries to fall down very quickly just because it's that heavy, that determines this very steep angle? Or is it something else, say, what's on top of it? So the material that couples the subducting plate with the plate on top of it, which we call the overriding plate. Is it the fact that it's subducting below an oceanic plate? Because the overriding plate in this case is oceanic, while a similar plate, say in Japan, which is not... It is younger in places, actually similar age, but definitely subducts at a lower angle. So maybe it's because it's subducting below Japan. Maybe it's something else that has to do with it. And these things are sort of topics of active research. So people do look at properties of the overriding plate, properties of the subducting plate, velocities and the mental flow below it, and so on. And that will help to determine how the subduction will look like, which... apart from being very, very interesting to us as researchers, it's also very important to people who are living in those places.
Yes, because there are geological features that are associated with subduction zones. 75% of the world's active volcanoes are all along the Ring of Fire, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's strongly related to subduction. And we have earthquakes due to the friction between plates that get generated because of subduction zones as well.
As one mechanism, yeah. So if we think about hazards in the association with subduction, there's a lot of volcanoes, but that goes back to the question, say, of angle, right? If it's a very steep angle, or a very shallow angle, that will determine the distance between the trench, where the plate bends towards the mantle, and where the volcano actually forms. There are many other aspects of it. So the question of how much fluid is carried with the plate into the mantle will determine how easy it is to form these lavas that then erupt from volcanoes.
So just to make it clear, so how do these volcanoes form from a subducting plate exactly?
Oh, okay. So we can talk about sort of an ideal mechanism, but you should keep in mind that there are different volcanoes forming in different ways. But what sort of most people think about as an ideal process is that so rock that contains a lot of fluid, things like sediments, for example. And I'm not talking here about like pore fluids. I'm talking about fluid that is incorporated within the rock itself as part of the chemistry of the rock itself. These materials, they go into the upper mantle, usually the asthenosphere, sometimes deeper than that. And then they heat up. And as they heat up, they break, and many of these fluids, they're getting released. They're released, they're mixed with the mantle, which lowers the mantle, the rocks that are forming the mantle has their own melting point. When they're interacting with fluids, this melting point changes, and so they become more fluid, and they're able and more buoyant, and they're able to penetrate through the overriding plate. Again, that's kind of a very ideal process, because people who are doing volcanoes, they will tell you that there's a lot of intermediate process there. So it's not enough to release the fluid. You sort of need to have an interaction with the mantle surrounding it, and then it has to go through the overriding plate, which is a process by itself. But ideally, that's kind of the case. You bring fluids down, you change the composition of the mantle, and that allows it to penetrate through the overriding plate.
Okay, so the idea is, so a plate is subducted, and as it does that, the crust with the fluids melt, and then the fluid interacts with the magma, which rises back through the crust above it. And so the angle at which the subducted plate, if it's a shallow angle, it means it takes longer to get to a certain depth in which it melts. So then that increases the distance between the trench and the volcano.
It does, but there's also the question of velocity. So if you think about a plate that is subducting very quickly, you'll have colder material getting to a greater depth. Again, depends on the angle, but also the velocity. So that will also determine the distance and the material that actually gets to mix, because if the plate subducts very, very slowly, it moves very slowly, it will heat up relatively quickly, and it might be that if you have a very thick overriding plate, it will start interacting with the plate itself. It won't even reach the mantle by the time that these rocks, the rocks that contain a lot of fluids, when they start releasing their fluids back. So there are different things that will determine that. But yes, the angle is one of them. Velocity is very important, one of them as well. Of course, the thickness of the overriding plate as well.
So we've got volcanoes that form, and earthquakes are associated with subduction zones as well. But are the strongest earthquakes, associated with subduction zones, or not necessarily?
Yes, but not only. Or maybe we should say there's a difference between the strongest earthquakes and the deadliest ones. Say, for example, the recent earthquakes in Turkey and the one that was in Morocco, these were not on subduction zones. These caused by a different process. But there's a very famous one in Chile that was magnitude 9, I think. Okay. It was quite devastating. So, yes, the biggest ones tend to be associated with subduction zones. But again, just don't mix those with the ones that you hear about in the news necessarily.
I mean, someone like the San Andreas fault, that's a conservative plate boundary, right, where two plates are just sliding along each other.
Yes. It doesn't generate that many big earthquakes. I mean, it generates a lot of, say, medium-sized earthquakes, and it's just really deadly because it's in a very densely populated area. But like the big ones, say North America, you'll see mostly in, say, Alaska, where you have subduction there. You'll see a lot in South America and Central America, where you have active subduction there. There's a lot in Japan. So the famous earthquake that caused the tsunami back in 2011. That was a subduction zone earthquake. But again, there are examples of those that aren't. So, for example, there was another one in, I think, 2014 in Nepal that caused a lot of damage, but that wasn't associated with subduction. Or it is associated with a converging boundary, but not of subduction type. It's a different kind of
because because not every convergent plate boundary where two plates are coming together actually causes subduction, because the density might be very similar between the two plates. So there's no slide underneath each other; they just hit each other and then rise up.
Well, remember that it's not the density contrast between the plates that causes subduction. It's the density contrast between the plate and the mantle below it.
Okay.
So if you have, for example, two oceanic plates coming together, say like the Marianas, then yes, you'll have subduction. If you have something like a converging boundary in the Himalayas, so one that has on the one side the Asia plate or the Euro-Asian plate, which is light because it's a continent, and on the other side you have India, which used to be attached to an oceanic plate, but now it's just a continental plate. Both of them are not capable of subduction. Again, not because they have similar densities, because both of them are too light to subduct into the mantle.
Okay, that makes complete sense to me. And last, want to talk about the Ring of Fire, because it's such an amazing geological phenomenon that occurs around the Pacific, the edges of the Pacific. And as I said earlier, I think 75% of all active volcanoes form around the edges of the Pacific. Is that all a subduction zone, or is it a mix and merge between different boundaries and,
So maybe it's a kind of a good segue in a way. I'll use your question to sort of describe where you see subduction globally.
Okay.
And so the first thing to say is that, yes, around the entire Pacific plate, so that will be the Pacific Ocean, you have subduction zones. It's not, say, 100% true, but let's give it 80% true. You don't really see subduction below Antarctica. So that's the southern side. But all the rest of them, almost everything is subduction. I mean, there's an area, say, between Tonga and the Marianas that doesn't have subduction, but I think we can leave that aside. It's a very interesting part. I think it's worth a whole episode on it by itself. And then outside the Pacific plate, there's a lot of subduction happening in the Mediterranean. So all these active volcanoes you hear about in Italy, for example, this is all due to subduction. There's a lot of dormant volcanoes all around the Mediterranean. I don't know if you discussed this before, but the Mediterranean used to be a very, very big ocean like the Pacific. Just as material subducted, of course, the oceanic plates disappeared. And so this very, very big ocean became this relatively small sea, but it still has all these features around it that are associated with subduction. So that's where a lot of subduction happening. That's sort of where subduction research is happening. And there are bits and pieces around the Atlantic. So there's subduction in the Antilles. So say that's say Central America-ish. Where the Caribbeans are. And there's another small subduction zone we call the Scotia subduction that's between South America and Antarctica. So it's small subduction happening there. And there's a bit of subduction happening at the straits leading into the Mediterranean. So say between Morocco and Gibraltar. But apart from that, there isn't really subduction on the Atlantic side. And that tells you that the Atlantic is an opening ocean. So it creates material in its mid-ocean ridge, but it doesn't lose material in subduction zones. While other plates, like the Pacific plate, like the Mediterranean, they're losing material as time goes on, so they're shrinking as time goes on. And of course, at some point, this oceanic plate in the Mediterranean, it will become older and older. It will become thicker and colder and denser. And so eventually it will have to fall back into the mantle. So you will have formation of subduction zones in the future, just not at the moment.
Okay. But that also explains there's no subduction going on in the Atlantic, really. That explains why we don't really have many big earthquakes in the UK.
It does, although you should remember the other processes that cause earthquakes. So, for example, there's a famous one in Lisbon that destroyed the entire city, and that wasn't associated with subduction. So, yes, there is less earthquakes hazard there, but it's not zero. Of course, there are earthquakes in Britain. They're just not of big magnitude. So again, other processes, they can cause earthquakes too.
Subduction zones are full of more bad than good. There's volcanoes and earthquakes.
Well, that depends on your point of view, because subductions will also help the formations of resources. So things that we'd like to mine, for example.
Because of the rising magma through the crust.
So different processes, but the fact that you have a lot of heat and a lot of pressure involved in subduction means that you have concentrations of certain materials and not others. And sometimes those materials are ones that you want to get. It really depends on your point of view, but really it's kind of hard to talk about subduction or any large geological feature in sort of a good or bad kind of point of view, because really you can't avoid subduction zones, right? You can't avoid all the land around the Pacific. It's where I would guess large percentage of humanity lives. It's kind of what they say about rising seas, where we should be afraid of the rising seas, but really most people would like to live by the sea. Like most people would like to live by volcanoes, for example, because there's a very fertile soil there. So good and bad is a matter of point of view or more of a specific topic you want to discuss. I wouldn't say subduction zones have more bad than good in that sense.
No,
rightly defending your research here.
Oh no, I would love subduction zones to be really, really bad. That means a lot of people would like to study them more. But the truth is, it's just a feature that is there, and it's interesting because we live next to it. Really, if it was a feature on, say, one of the moons of Jupiter, it would have been interesting, but not as interesting to that many people.
Exactly. Leo, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast. It's been really interesting, and thank you so much for talking about subduction zones. And if you want to come again and talk about the Ring of Fire, you're more than welcome to.
I'd love to. Thank you for inviting me.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. Mark, thanks very much for coming on again.
Thanks for having
me. Appreciate it. And thanks everyone for listening as well.
Bye.
Bye-bye.